It was past midnight when I turned the lock on the store door and stepped inside. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, painting the linoleum in a harsh, sickly white. I shrugged off my jacket and hung it on the peg near the entrance, the sound of the fabric brushing against the hook unusually loud in the oppressive quiet. The night shift was slow. Tonight, I was alone. The last customer had left nearly an hour ago, and the only sound had been the low hum of the refrigeration units and the occasional drip from the ice machine. I flicked on the PA system to make an announcement about closing early. Static crackled through the speaker, then cut out, leaving a silence thick enough to press against the eardrums. That's when I first noticed it, the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the aisles. At first, I thought it was a late customer who had returned, so I called out, "Hello? Anyone still here?" My voice bounced off the high shelves, sounding oddly distant, hollow. No reply came. The footsteps continued, slow, deliberate, circling through the aisles. I listened more closely. They weren't just walking straight down an aisle, they were looping, returning to the same point over and over, but never in the same rhythm. Sometimes they paused mid-step as if listening, then resumed. The sound came from the speakers, yes, but the spatial placement was wrong. I could hear the echo from the frozen foods, then from the candy aisle, then near the registers, as if something or someone was moving in impossible paths through the store. I set my jacket aside and picked up a mop, telling myself it was just a prank, a trick of acoustics. The PA system was old, prone to feedback and delay. Still, I felt my pulse tighten as the footsteps responded almost immediately to my movements. I took a step toward the snack aisle, and the steps followed me, circling more quickly. I froze. When I stopped, they slowed to a measured pace, circling, but not entirely away from my location. I switched off the music and scanned the aisles, my eyes adjusting to the fluorescent glare and the shadows cast between the shelves. Nothing moved. Nothing should have moved. Yet the sound persisted, a constant rotation of heavy, deliberate steps. I crouched behind a shelf to test my theory. Maybe the store's acoustics were bouncing the sound strangely. My knees pressed into the cold linoleum. The footsteps slowed, then resumed, circling again, tracing my position perfectly. The hum of the fluorescent lights fluctuated, dipping and rising in pitch as the footsteps moved. Every once in a while, a faint crackle from the PA would accompany a shift in pace, as though the speakers themselves were straining under some unseen weight. I tried to rationalize it, old wiring, echoing audio, my imagination. But the store was silent except for the hum, except for the footsteps, which were unmistakably alive. I decided to investigate, moving cautiously down the aisle toward the dairy section. The sound circled faster as I approached, but not randomly, almost as if it were aware of my exact location, responding to my presence. My shoes made no noise, though the footsteps behind me were distinct. I spun around. No one was there. The reflection in the refrigerator glass showed empty aisles, my own pale face staring back, wide-eyed. Yet the footsteps continued, now doubling, echoing unnaturally in a way that the PA system alone couldn't account for. I tried calling into the intercom. "Is someone there? Stop messing around." My voice trembled. The response was immediate. A soft, rhythmic thudding, circling, moving faster when I approached an aisle, slowing when I paused. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a recording I could recognize. It was something else entirely. Something sentient, aware, and patient. I backed toward the registers, hands trembling, eyes flicking between the reflected fluorescent lights and the shifting shadows between aisles. Each shelf seemed taller, narrower, elongating subtly as the footsteps rotated, wrapping the store around itself in ways that were impossible. The candy aisle ended in a blur. The snack aisle curved slightly inward. The freezer door reflected another aisle behind me that didn't exist in reality. The footsteps moved through them all, precisely, deliberately. I tried to leave, moving toward the front door, but the footsteps accelerated, cutting off the space ahead of me, making it impossible to reach the exit without intersecting the sound. It circled faster now, a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, and I could swear I felt a vibration through the floorboards. My reflection in the glass panels stretched and twisted subtly, an exaggerated echo of myself moving slightly out of sync with my own steps. I told myself it was an elaborate prank. Maybe someone had planted a speaker system to torment me. But the footsteps did not replay, did not loop like a normal recording. They reacted, they shifted, they anticipated. I could make small turns, small pauses, and the sound would adjust, sweeping around, always following, always aware. I approached the back of the store, considering the storage room, hoping for some rational explanation. The footsteps slowed almost imperceptibly, then resumed in a pattern that seemed to loop endlessly, never quite leaving, never quite settling. I pressed my ear to the PA speaker above the freezer section. The hiss of static was low and insistent, but beneath it, I could hear my own movements echoed in the steps. My reflection in the polished refrigerator glass showed my arm twitch slightly before I moved it. The clock above the registers ticked, but the second hand moved inconsistently. The fluorescent lights flickered in a staccato rhythm, and the hum of the refrigeration units pitched higher as the footsteps continued to circle. Every shelf I passed, every narrow aisle, every reflective surface multiplied the sound, looping it, layering it in ways that made it impossible to determine origin. I could not tell where the footsteps were, only that they were everywhere at once, and all their motion was directed at me. I considered leaving the store through the emergency exit at the rear. As I approached, the footsteps surged, circling in a pattern I could not track, suddenly surrounding me, accelerating, then pausing, almost mockingly. My shadow stretched across the tiles, flickering in the fluorescent glow, splitting and elongating along shelves that had not existed moments before. I stopped, pressed my back against a shelf, and the footsteps slowed, but they did not stop. I realized then that the sound of the steps was not simply coming from the speakers. It was in the air, in the reflections, in the pauses and accelerations, in the store itself. It responded to my breathing, to the shift of my weight, to the subtle tremor in my hands. The store was not empty, and it had not been all along. I could feel its attention, patient and quiet, circling, always circling. I sank to the floor, listening to the footsteps rotate endlessly. The hum of the fluorescents, the crackle of the speakers, the subtle echo of my own presence. They all merged into one oppressive rhythm. I could not leave, could not distinguish reality from reflection, could not escape the store's awareness. Every attempt to move, every tentative step was mirrored and amplified, a slow, inescapable test. Hours or minutes or seconds passed. I could not tell. The footsteps continued to circle, responding, looping, never pausing, never tiring. They moved not toward me, not away, but around me, a constant, deliberate presence. I realized with a cold certainty that I was not in control. The store was, or something inside it was, and I had become part of its endless pattern. I no longer reach for the lights, no longer call into the intercom. I sit in the aisle, watching shadows stretch impossibly along the shelves, hearing my own movements echoed and twisted by the circulating steps. The fluorescent hum is a lullaby and a warning. The speakers crackle in acknowledgement. The footsteps have learned me, and I can feel them studying my hesitation, my breathing, the slight twitch of my fingers. I do not know how long I will remain. The door remains locked. The checkout tills are empty. And yet, somewhere beyond the reflection in the glass, beyond the narrow aisles and the flickering lights, I can feel them circling, always circling, waiting. It was nearly 2 in the morning when he walked in, the door chiming softly, reverberating in the empty store like a tentative warning. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, harsh and unwavering, reflecting faintly off the polished tiles and the edges of the metal shelves. I had been straightening cans in the snack aisle, hands sticky from syrup that dripped unnoticed, when he appeared. His jacket was soaked with rain, droplets sliding down the fabric as he hesitated between the aisles. "Excuse me," he said, voice low, careful. "Is the invisible aisle still hard to find?" I froze mid-motion, a can in my hand, unsure whether he was joking, drunk, or something else entirely. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. I'm not sure I know what you mean. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. It's the one that only shows itself sometimes. Hard to see even when you're standing right in front of it. His gaze drifted past me, scanning the shelves, but the angle of his stare made it feel as though he were looking through the store itself. I nodded politely, forcing a laugh. Well, we don't have anything labeled like that. But something about the way he spoke made the air feel heavier, charged, the fluorescent hum suddenly intrusive, pressing against my ears. He turned and walked down a narrow aisle that I didn't recognize. My eyes followed him. The aisle seemed wrong, too deep, though the layout of the store didn't allow for it. Shelves stretched taller than they should have, and the lights at the far end flickered ever so slightly, producing a subtle ripple in the reflections along the polished linoleum. I set the can back down and started to follow, and that's when I noticed the smell. Dusty, metallic, a faint tang of something that reminded me of old paper and wet cement. It wasn't in the main store, not near the registers or the frozen foods, but somewhere deeper. As I stepped toward the aisle, the shelves seemed to bend subtly, the snack aisle stretching into a corridor that I didn't remember existing. The man didn't look back. He walked slowly, deliberately, fingers brushing along the tops of the cans as if testing the texture, measuring the space. The fluorescent hum above him warped, fluctuating in pitch as though acknowledging his presence, as though the store itself were alive and aware. I followed cautiously, the aisle's walls pressed closer as I entered, the shelving shimmering at the edges of vision. The linoleum beneath my feet seemed to extend further, creating a long, impossible stretch. I caught glimpses of reflected light in the metal shelf edges, distorted and twisting, as if the store's geometry had shifted slightly, folding over itself. The man paused in front of a blank stretch of shelving. I stepped forward, heart tight in my chest. The shelves shimmered, faint, almost imperceptibly, like a mirage. And then, slowly, an aisle appeared. A narrow corridor between rows of products that hadn't been there a moment ago. The fluorescent light above it pulsed faintly, just enough to highlight the polished tile and the labels on the cans. "This is it?" he whispered, not looking at me, fingers brushing the cans as though they were alive. "Not many people notice it." I swallowed, unsure whether to speak. The aisle felt impossibly long, though I could see the end reflected faintly in the stainless steel of the freezer doors beyond. The air was thicker here, humid, carrying a faint scent of mildew and wax polish. Each step I took made the linoleum hum softly underfoot, an almost imperceptible vibration that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I glanced back. The man was gone. I spun slowly, trying to retrace the path, but the main store beyond the aisle looked subtly altered. The snack aisle seemed further away than it should, the checkout counter tilted at an unnatural angle. The fluorescent lights hummed steadily again, but the reflection of the store in the freezer glass showed a different layout, corridors stretching where there should have been none. I turned back to the aisle. It remained narrow and precise, products on either side shimmering faintly at the edges. I stepped inside, hesitant, letting my fingers brush against the cans. The labels seemed familiar, yet slightly off, brands I knew, but with letters misplaced, colors too vivid, shapes warped subtly. The deeper I went, the more the shelf edges wavered in my peripheral vision, bending the space into something that didn't obey normal geometry. I tried calling out, "Hello!" My voice echoed strangely, bouncing off shelves that shouldn't have been there, distorting in time, stretched and compressed. There was no response, just the subtle vibration underfoot and the hum of fluorescent light overhead. Each aisle I passed seemed to fold in on itself, elongating in impossible ways, yet leading me toward a vanishing point I couldn't locate. The man's words echoed in my memory, "Only shows itself sometimes." I realized then that the aisle didn't appear for everyone. Perhaps it didn't appear at all unless it wanted to. And now that it had noticed me, it stretched, shifted, expanded, and contracted in subtle, deliberate ways. The air itself felt measured, pressing lightly against my shoulders, guiding me without force. I caught my reflection in the glass of a freezer. My face looked pale, stretched slightly, eyes wider than they should have been. And just behind me in the reflection, I thought I saw the man, standing still at the edge of the aisle, head tilted, watching. When I blinked, he was gone. The aisle hummed softly, fluorescent light pulsing gently in acknowledgement, or perhaps in amusement. I tried to backtrack. The path I had taken vanished, the store beyond folding subtly, aisles rearranging themselves. I found myself in a stretch of tile I didn't recognize, between shelves that curved impossibly, the products aligned in neat rows that defied logic. I turned in a slow circle. The invisible aisle remained there, pulsing faintly at the edge of perception, yet impossible to fully grasp. Time became slippery. Each step I took stretched moments into minutes. Shadows lengthened and compressed along the shelves in ways that felt unnatural. The fluorescent hum persisted, comforting and oppressive at once. The floor vibrated subtly with every heartbeat, the labels shimmering, the reflection in the freezer glass showing corridors that didn't exist. I began to understand. The aisle was not simply hidden. It was aware, deliberate, perhaps even sentient. It responded to my attention, my hesitation, my curiosity. My presence seemed to give it shape, though it could vanish at any moment, fold space around me, stretch or contract reality according to some internal rhythm I could not discern. I turned another corner. The aisle stretched forward, beckoning. I could feel the pull, a quiet insistence to follow, though my legs trembled, unwilling yet compelled. The hum of the fluorescence shifted slightly in pitch, a subtle signal, almost a heartbeat. The reflection in the freezer glass showed the aisle behind me, looping impossibly back, a corridor folding over itself in ways my mind refused to comprehend. I stopped, pressing my back against the cold metal of a shelf. My reflection blinked, not in sync with me. I could feel it observing me from the glass, the aisle bending subtly at the edges of vision, teasing me with glimpses of a geometry that shouldn't exist. I tried to leave, retrace my steps, but the invisible aisle responded instantly, shifting, stretching, disappearing then reappearing just out of reach, always beyond my grasp. I realized with cold certainty that I had become part of it. The aisle did not merely exist in space. It existed in perception, in attention, in the quiet folds of the mind. It would remain, patient and deliberate, waiting, stretching, shifting, always observing. And I could not escape it, not fully. Not while I remained aware, not while I remembered the texture of the shelves, the fluorescent hum, the impossible reflections. I sank to the floor, listening to the faint hum and the subtle vibrations beneath my feet. The aisle pulsed gently, acknowledging my presence. Beyond the aisles I knew, beyond the rows of snacks and canned goods, the invisible corridor waited, patient and sentient, bending space and perception to its will. I do not know if I will ever leave, if anyone ever truly does. I only know that it waits, and I remain.